Hey there, this is Dave from Dev Playbook, and today we're going to do our first Dev Playbook video. We're going to walk through creating REST web services in Java with Spring Boot. In the next 10 minutes or so, we are going to use Spring Initializer to create our project. We're going to import it into Eclipse. We will build out a model and a controller. We will run the application as a Java application on the Tomcat server that Spring Boot will provide us. And then we're going to test it in the browser. In order to get through this, you're going to need to know a fair amount of Java. You don't have to be an expert, but you need to be comfortable with Java. You need Eclipse, which we're going to use the Oxygen version of Eclipse. We are going to need to understand REST web services and what they are and what they do. We're going to create a GET service today, so we'll leave the post and put and patch and delete actions for another time. So that should be it. Now let's get started. All right, our first step is that we're going to visit start.spring.io from your browser. You can see that right here. This is the Spring Initializer, and it essentially allows us to generate a Spring application with everything that we need. I'm just going to generate a Maven project with Java, and I'm just going to use this particular version of Spring, 1.5.10. So just keeping all of the defaults. I'm going to change my group to Dev Playbook. So this will be my package name initially, and my artifact is going to be called name-meaning. We're going to create a web service that will return the meaning of my name. I'm going to add web as a dependency, and I'm just simply going to click Generate Project. And you're going to see right here that it's going to generate a zip file, and in that zip file, I'm going to have some source code. I'm going to have a pom.xml. So I've got everything that I need. In the next step, we're going to extract that and create our Eclipse project. Okay, so I'm going to go into my name-meaning.zip. And in here, we see that I have all of this stuff right here. So what I really want to do is basically extract this. And the way I'm going to do it is I'm just going to copy this from the zip file. I'm going to go here. I'm going to do a new folder called name meaning. And then I'm going to just paste all this stuff in there. Simple as that. You could also extract just the name meaning into your project folder wherever you want that to be. But that's how I do it. And it took me about 30 seconds, including explaining it to you. All right, so the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to open my Eclipse IDE. And I'm going to select a directory for a workspace for my project. I put my workspaces under my users David projects, and I'm just going to call it name meaning. And I'm going to go ahead and launch that right now. Okay, now that I've launched Eclipse, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go over here to my Package Explorer, and I'm just going to do an import. Under here, I'm going to go to Maven. And I'm going to import an existing Maven project. So you remember, whenever we imported this, we said we're going, or whenever we generated our project, we said we're going to generate a Maven project with Java. So I am importing an existing Maven project. Remember that we extracted it to C projects name meaning, which is where our pom.xml exists. So it's going to find that, auto-detect it. We're going to click Finish. It is going to take a moment, because it's got to not only bring in the code here, but then it actually has to import Maven projects. It has to import all of the dependencies by looking at our pom.xml and saying, okay, what are the packages that I need to download? So it's just going to take a minute. And you see that it refreshes. And now we have all of our source code in here that is auto-generated with Spring Initializer. We have all of our Maven dependencies. So these are all the jar files, all the various libraries that comprise Spring Boot with the web package, with the web starter package, and this is our application. All right, the first thing we're going to do is we're going to create our first model. I'm going to right click on the package name here, and a model is really just a plain old Java object, or a POJO. So I'm going to say class right here. I like to put my models in a separate package called model, and I'm going to call it name. I understand that's probably not a great name for a class, but that's what we're going to go with. And I'm going to click Finish, and it's going to generate the shell, which is really just a declaration of my class. Next up, we're going to build this out. Okay, we're finally ready to do a little bit of coding, which is always the fun part. Within my class, within my model, I am going to create a private string called name, a private string called meaning, a private string called gender, and a private integer called length. Okay, so now these are going to be the properties of my class here. And then within Eclipse, I can actually generate my getters and my setters and my constructors pretty easily. If I hit Alt, Shift, and S, I'm going to get this menu here. And I'm going to say generate getters and setters. I'm going to select these and I'm going to hit OK. And you're going to see that it's going to generate all of this stuff for me. Again, I'm going to hit Alt, Shift, and S. And I'm going to come down here and say generate constructor using fields. And I'm just going to create one constructor that takes a name field, and it's going to put it right there for me. And that really is going to be my entire class. That's the whole thing. That's all I need. All right, now it's time to generate a controller. Generating a controller is actually going to be one of the more complicated pieces, or actually the most complicated piece of this whole thing. I'm going to start again by just generating a class. I like to put my controllers in a package called controller, and then I'm going to call it name controller. So you notice that I am naming it sort of in line with the model that I just created because it's primarily going to operate on that model. I'm going to go ahead and click Finish, and it's going to generate that for me right there. Okay, so now it's time to do the really hard work, and we're going to try to get through it relatively quickly. Again, go back to your HTTP methods and RESTful web services theories, so you should already have a pretty good understanding about that. So we're not going to explain a lot about it here. So we're going to move pretty quickly, though. Let's start. We need to tell Spring that this is a REST controller, that this is a controller that is going to receive a request, process that request, and return some kind of response. But in order to do that, we're going to annotate the class as a REST controller. I'm going to hit Control, Shift, and O to organize my imports within Eclipse. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to create a public method, so it needs to be able to be executed publicly. And I'm going to call it name meaning, and it is going to return a name. Note that when I hit Control, Shift, and O, it's going to ask me which one I want, and I'm going to use the one that we created, the model that we just created right there. I want this method to take a parameter of string name. And then I also need to be able to tell Spring that this is a request param, and that it can expect on the query string for that value to be called name. Organized by imports, you'll see that it brings in the request param right there. The next thing is I need to be able to tell Spring that I am mapping this particular method to a URL that is being requested. So I can say name meaning right here, and to an HTTP method. So I can say request method dot get. Okay, so I'm saying this is a request mapping, and whenever we get this URL coming in on our web server in a get HTTP method, we want to execute the contents or the logic that is contained within name meaning right here. I'm going to hit Control O to organize my imports, and you notice that my squiggly lines will go away. What we're going to do is we're going to create a name object called in, and we're going to call the constructor and pass the name that came in right here. And let's just go down here and say return n. Okay, and now you'll notice that our little squiggly line there goes away because we're now returning something. Let's do something like this. If the name equals ignore case, because we don't know if it's going to come in uppercase or lowercase. So we're just going to say if it's equal to David, we're going to set the gender to M, and we are going to set the meaning to the meaning of my name, and we're going to say n.setLength is going to be equal to name.length. Okay. Now notice that we could take this name.length, this particular one right here, we could actually move that to the constructor in our name model if we wanted to. For now, I'm not going to do that, but we'll just kind of move on. I'm going to put an else in here, and in this case, I'm just going to say set gender to you, because we don't really know. Set meaning to unknown. And then we're going to set length to name.length. And you might be saying, you know what? Why do you have the same line of code in two places at one time? Good question. We're just going to do this down here because we're always doing it. Okay. Again, we could move that to our constructor if we wanted to. So that is our whole method that will actually allow us to hit a URL on our web server at /name meaning using an HTTP GET request. If we pass a name parameter on the query string that's equal to David, regardless of the case, it's going to return these values. Otherwise, it is going to return unknown. You could change this to add an else if or whatever. And in a real life scenario, you're probably going to have this hitting a database to return some value that you find in the database. We don't need to do that right now. It's out of the scope of this lesson, but this is what we have. So next up, we're going to run our application, and then we're going to test it in the browser. Okay, so all the work we've done so far is basically building up to the ability to run our application, open a browser, navigate to a URL, and see the results. Okay, so let's do this. If we take a look real quick at the name meaning application.java, this is what Spring Initializer creates as our class that includes our runnable main method. And essentially all this does is it just runs the Spring application. That's pretty much all it does. When it's a web application, Spring will actually run on a Tomcat server that's embedded in the Spring Boot package that you generate with your Maven project. So what we're going to do is we're going to come down here and we're going to say run as Java application. It is going to start up, and the default configuration is going to run on Tomcat port 8080. So we're going to switch over here and we're going to go to localhost, which is our local machine. We're going to go to 8080. You can see that I visited this before. Name equals David. And look at that. We get a return of a JSON or JavaScript object notation object. And it's very simple text that has the name, the meaning, the gender, and the length. That sounds familiar, right? It sounds familiar because this is our class over here, our name, meaning, gender, and length. It has all of these properties. So essentially what Spring is doing is it's saying, okay, I've got name, meaning right here, and I have a mapping right over here. Because I'm entering it in a browser, I am actually getting a request method of HTTP type GET. And so I'm going to execute the logic that exists within this controller, and that means I'm going to return a name object. And Spring automatically takes that name object and turns it into a JSON object, and that's what we see right here. That's pretty cool, right? And that, my friends, is your very first RESTful web service in Java with Spring Boot. And that's the end of the lesson. Thanks for watching this Dev Playbook. Visit us at devplaybook.com for many more. We provide you with step-by-step playbooks for building better, faster, and smarter web applications. You can also sign up for the newsletter, volunteer to contribute, or you can follow us on Twitter at @TheDevPlaybook.